The Reverend Thomas Guthrie, Scottish philanthropist and social reformer, is famous for his fight for free education for the poor and the formation of the ragged schools. However, he always insisted that his inspiration came from a humble shoemaker in Portsmouth. This is the story of how free education for all was born. If you walk along the old High Street in the naval town of Portsmouth, you'll come across a small Unitarian church. It was built in 1955 to replace the original chapel that had been destroyed in the Second World War, and it's dedicated to the memory of a man named John Pounds. Then walk through the well-kept garden at the side and you'll see in front of you a simple memorial stone. Beside it stands a full-size replica of an 18th century shop. And it was inside a small downstairs room of the original building that the actions of one kindly man resulted eventually in free education for all. Using a book written by the Reverend Henry Hawkes, a man who knew him well, it has been possible to research the story of the crippled cobbler. This bent-over man is called John Pounds, and the children are just a few of what he affectionately called his little vagabonds. As you can see, the man is mending shoes, but what is not so obvious is that he's teaching these ragged children to read, write, and do sums. In this built-to-size replica of John Pounds' actual premises, just 7 feet by 16 feet, with one room up and one room down, over a period of 23 years, John Pounds provided hundreds of Portsmouth's poorest children with a basic education. John Pounds was born in 1766 in what was then called St Mary's Street. His father worked in the naval dockyard and, aged just 12, John became an apprentice shipwright and joined him there. He should have had a secure future, but fate had other ideas. 3 years into his apprenticeship and just 2 days after the death of his father, he fell a great height from the partly built HMS Narcissus into a dry dock. He lived but was seriously injured and permanently disabled. He was of no further use in the dockyard. During the long months of recovery, he set about educating himself, learning to read, write, and do arithmetic, and, having a keen mind, he was capable of retaining much of the information he read. As soon as he was able, he became an apprentice again, but this time to a shoemaker. This provided him with a means of earning a living where he could sit whilst doing his work. At age 27, he branched out on his own and took on the smallest premises he could find, once again in St Mary's Street. And that's where he stayed for the rest of his life. He never married, but for some years he happily worked and lived alone, surrounded by his birds and animals. Although poor himself, he was always ready to lend a hand to his neighbours, share his food with them, or to tend the sick. The Reverend Hawkes tells us that in 1816 he even took on the care and upbringing of his young nephew, who had been born deformed with both feet turning in and overlapping. John called him his little Neffy. Whilst John worked repairing shoes, little Neffy played in the workshop alongside him, and John encouraged other children to come in and keep him company. Now, it should be remembered that at this time there were no social service benefits, no national health service, and no free education. Poor people struggled just to survive. Knowing the importance of a basic education, John started to give the children lessons. and in no time neighbours started asking if their children could join them. If the parent could not afford paid education, the answer was always, of course they can. And so, almost by accident, John Pound's little school began. He understood the plight of the homeless, unwanted urchin children living in the slum areas around the docks. And so at night he went out, taking them food and encouraging them to come to his workshop and join the other children. He called them all his little vagabonds. The book tells us that this classroom was like none you have ever known, and John Pound's like no traditional teacher. There were no desks or chairs, just a few slates to write on. The children sat on the floor and stairs, leant against the wall, even stood outside the window. Reading materials consisted mainly of old books and Bibles donated by locals. However, in this small room, while still repairing shoes, he managed to teach up to 40 children at a time to read, write, add up and do tables. The book tells us that he also taught them to cook simple food, mend their clothes and repair their shoes. He was rough-spoken and unkempt, but he gave them his total attention and they loved him. Many of them lived in squalid conditions and had little access to clean, fresh air. So he would sometimes take them into the country for the day, all the time, though, teaching them about nature or just general knowledge. Being a regular attendee at the nearby Unitarian church, he encouraged those of the children who wanted to accompany him to the service on Sunday. Over time, using his skills as a shoemaker, he managed to straighten little Neffy's feet, and, as this original photograph shows, he grew into a fine young man. For 23 years, John Pound carried on teaching and befriending hundreds of the poorest children of Portsmouth, until, on New Year's Day in 1839, he collapsed suddenly and died. He was 73. The outpouring of grief at the death of this kindly old man was unbelievable. It seemed as if everyone in Portsmouth knew him. Hundreds turned out for his funeral, even though it was a bitter winter's day. Obituaries started to appear in the local papers, all telling of his work with the poor children of Portsmouth. These were taken up by county and national papers. His story even spread as far as America. This man, previously only known to his neighbours and his little vagabonds, was becoming famous and an inspiration to others. The people of Portsmouth wanted something to remember him by, and a collection was started for a memorial stone. Pennies and halfpennies poured in, and donations arrived from home and abroad. In Scotland, preacher and social reformer, the Reverend Thomas Guthrie, on seeing a copy of the painting of the poor cobbler surrounded by his urchin children, was so touched that he said he felt ashamed of himself for the little he had done. He immediately threw himself wholeheartedly into the cause of ragged schools and opened this one in Edinburgh. Being an educated man, Thomas Guthrie spread the word about the need for education for poor children by writing a pamphlet entitled Plea for the Ragged Schools, and this was published throughout the country. Charles Dickens, himself born in Portsmouth, wrote A Christmas Carol, highlighting the state of beggar children. As more charitable institutions and famous people took up the cause of education for the poor, ragged schools appeared in most large towns. Dr. Barnardo opened this establishment in Copperfield Road, a particularly run-down area of East London. It now houses the Ragged School Museum. The Ragged School Union was formed, with the aim of supporting anyone opening a free school, and Lord Ashley was its president. Such was the pressure that this placed on the government that in 1870, 31 years after the death of John Pounds, the Elementary Education Act was passed. This placed a statutory duty on local councils across England and Wales to provide free education for all children between the ages of 5 and 12. Scotland followed in 1872 and extended the upper age to 13. Free education for all had started. Whilst Thomas Guthrie was widely acknowledged as being the founder of the Ragged Schools, he always insisted that John Pounds was the inspiration. In fact, having journeyed from Edinburgh to Portsmouth in order to see for himself where the crippled cobbler had worked and taught, he wrote, "This was the humble birthplace of a great scheme."